Putin's secret plan in Odessa. For about 2 weeks now, Russia has been carrying out airstrikes on the bridges that connect the Odessa region with the rest of Ukraine. As a result of these attacks, this strategic region is now completely cut off from Ukraine and at the mercy of a possible Russian amphibious assault. What does Putin really want in Odessa? Good evening, good afternoon, and good morning from Berlin, Germany. We begin broadcast number 310 of Demolishing Myths Talks, the first one after Christmas Eve dinner. And joining us here, as every Friday, he is naturally recovered, is Mr. Juan Antonio Aguilar from Madrid, Spain. Juan Antonio, how are things over there?
Juan Antonio Aguilar desde Madrid, España. Juan Antonio, ¿qué tal todo por ahí?
¿Qué tal? Muy bien. Pues nada, primero feliz Navidad.
How's it going? Very well. Well, first of all, Merry Christmas to anyone I haven't had the chance to say it to yet. Here we are, and, well, to start, let's clear something up. We don't have Putin's secret plan for Odessa. The secret plan didn't come through on Bizum. Let's try to analyze what the key points of that possible plan might be to solve the issue of Odessa, which is important in itself within the conflict in Ukraine.
Yes, without a doubt. Indeed, we lack Putin's secret plan. But in recent weeks, Juan Antonio, we have witnessed relatively new developments in this region, since Russia began carrying out attacks not only against critical infrastructure, in the sense of electrical and railway infrastructure, but also against port facilities and even ships. But above all, what's new appeared in the attacks on the bridges that connect the southern region of Odessa, this one here, with the rest of Ukraine. Mainly 2 bridges, one here, and now we're going to show some images from today, and another one down here. Very important bridges, not only because they connect this entire area with Ukraine, but also because they lie on the route to the ports of Reni and Ismail down here. Very significant Danube ports located on the Ukrainian side, with Romania on the opposite bank, essentially linking not only Odessa, but all of Ukraine with the rest of the country. That's the new development. The attacks on these ports, and above all, on the bridges that connect this region with the rest of Ukraine. And today, before Juan Antonio begins his analysis, well, first, the day before yesterday, these images. The trucks, yesterday, were still running across these bridges, although very, very damaged. If I remember correctly, 60% of the fuel coming from abroad, 60% of the imported fuel in Ukraine, crosses this bridge. Basically, just 2 days ago, the bridge was barely still passable, but only on one side. This is the image without sound in the original. There, quite damaged in that spot. There, on the right. Good. And here, another spot also damaged, with a hole. Another one. In recent days, we've shown multiple videos of the attacks, mostly with geraniums against this. And this is today's image. Pay attention directly to the construction, the assembly of a pontoon. This is the place of war. Replacing the main one, here on the left, you can see the bridge, that's why the pause, the bridge under repair, and a pontoon bridge. Here in this image you can see the vehicles, cars and, yes, pickup trucks, vans, not trucks. Whether this pontoon can handle the weight of the trucks or not, good question. And here's another image, this one at night, apparently also of another pontoon set up somewhere nearby. Well, what else, Juan Antonio? Also from today. Here, a direct attack on the port once again, an attack on the port of Ismail. Burning through the night. Well, luckily for us, since we don't know Russian or Ukrainian, that person was almost certainly insulting us. But anyway, Juan Antonio, what's the meaning of these attacks? What does Russia want? Could it launch an amphibious operation, an amphibious attack, once this region is cut off from the rest of Ukraine? What's your analysis?
Bueno, en primer lugar, lo primero, un análisis operacional.
Well, first of all, an operational analysis regardless of what future plans might be. Why is that area so important at the operational level? Because the two main routes for bringing in fuel, logistics, ammunition, weapons, and so on into Ukraine are roads coming from the Polish border, which, by the way, go through some tunnels, and it's quite likely that those tunnels will be attacked in the not-too-distant future. Most likely when the operation in the south is over, that is, the destruction of those bridges. The other route is this. Ships carrying supplies, fuel, and other goods arrive in Romania, unload there, and then by road through Ismail, cross those bridges to reach the rest of Ukraine.
Y por esos puentes llegan al resto de Ucrania, ¿no? Con lo cual, si tú destruyes esos puentes,
So, if you destroy those bridges, apart from the port of Ismail itself, like the one in Odesa, in such a way that it makes it very difficult to unload all kinds of weapon systems, ammunition, logistics, supplies, fuel, and everything else needed to sustain the war, then logically it will greatly hinder operations. As we've said many times, war is the management of resources. If your resources start to fail, both human and material, your ability to continue operations will become very limited. And that's what a war of attrition is about, wearing down the enemy until they can no longer keep fighting.
Acabar agotando al enemigo para que no pueda continuar combatiendo. Por lo cual, es decir, bueno, pues desde el punto de vista.
Therefore, from an operational point of view, that's the maneuver, to end up blocking all the supply routes for the Ukrainian army. The other one, as I said, is in the north, on the Polish border, and I'm convinced that when the time comes, those will also be attacked. If you manage to reduce by 10, 20, 30, or 40% the arrival of essential supplies such as fuel, you put trade and the ability to continue the war in serious trouble. For example, those pontoon bridges built by engineering units, depending on the type of bridge, can support only a certain number of tons. For instance, they can hold a tank, but only one.
Por ejemplo, pueden aguantar un carro de combate, pero es solo uno. Es decir, tienen que pasar de uno en uno. No puedes meter ahí una.
That is to say, they have to cross one at a time. You can't send a line of tanks or 40-ton fuel trucks across there, because the bridge would collapse. Besides, the bridge is much more fragile. It's not like a concrete bridge with steel beams like the others. These ones, indeed, can be blown up with a single fab bomb. They're always very temporary structures. They're bridges that obviously have been supplied by NATO. Each of these bridges, well, there aren't that many pontoon units or bridges of this kind to be wasting them. Let's see how long NATO can keep supplying that type of bridge. Maybe there will come a time when they no longer have their own rivers. We'll see. Anyway, all of this is within the context of what Odesa is, and perhaps it's worth talking a bit about the importance of Odesa, the factors in the geopolitical context, and the elements at play there, its strategic importance, and finally looking at what possible scenarios might unfold. As I said at the beginning, Putin hasn't shared his secret plan with us, the fast hasn't worked, and we haven't received that secret plan. But we can try to make an analysis to see what kinds of scenarios might occur, and based on the signals that appear in the future, we can more or less determine what we might be facing. Let's start with a bit of background for those who don't know. Odesa is the third largest city in Ukraine, with more than 1 million inhabitants, or it had that many before the military operation. And it's the main commercial port on the Black Sea, along with Sevastopol. We already know that Sevastopol is on the Russian side, right? And Odesa remains the largest Ukrainian port. The first settlements there were Greek, Athenian Greeks, in fact, the ones who settled in that area. But then, after the Mongol invasions, it later belonged to the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, to Poland, to the Ottoman Empire, until in 1789 the Russian Empire ended up conquering the settlement with Cossack and Russian troops in command. And this is where it gets interesting, because I wanted to bring up this bit of cultural trivia. It was under the command of a Spanish admiral, José de Rivas, who was also a spy and served Catherine II of Russia. Well, in fact, José de Rivas had a statue in Odesa that the Kiev regime has removed, eliminated, I imagine because it was clearly a symbol of Russian imperialism, right? In other words, the damnatio memoriae, erasing historical memory, is typical of tyrannies.
La damnatio memoriae, es decir, borrar la memoria histórica es lo típico de las tiranías. Es decir, una cosa que ocurrió en 1780.
That is to say, something that happened in 1789, well, taking down José de Rivas' statue now. That's the kind of thing typical of tyrannies. Erasing memory is what tyrannies do. I repeat it, because there's a lot of erasing memory going on out there. And as a curious and anecdotal fact, it must be said that the Spanish Navy hasn't said a word about Admiral José de Rivas. All those petty little admirals, with their rusty sabers, as rusty as their minds, haven't said a word, haven't even issued a note of protest, or at least expressed any discomfort over the removal of the statue of a Spanish admiral who founded what is today the city of Odesa. Not the ancient settlement, but what is now the city of Odesa, which also became, well, they called it the Pearl of the Black Sea, a free port, that is, a major commercial port. How long will this go on?
Puerto comercial de primer orden. ¿Hasta cuándo? Bueno, pues hasta que...
Well, until the Russian period came with the Soviet Union, it naturally belonged to the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic. During World War II, it suffered heavy damage because it was defended by a Romanian army corps, which at that time was allied with Hitler's Germany. And well, demographically, the Tatar population was significant. They were deported in those years, and the area was repopulated with Ukrainians. Even so, until 2014, 90% of the population had Russian as their native language. In other words, it has always been a Russian city, historically Russian. Well, always meaning since the city was founded. In the ancient Greek settlement, of course, they were Greeks. So sure enough, some fool will come along with one of those silly arguments. It's an interesting point that matters right now.
Una cosa curiosa que tiene su importancia en estos momentos. Para hacer la ciudad,
To build the city, earth was taken from galleries, a kind of catacomb. A network of tunnels was created to extract sedimentary rock and make it possible to build the city in the 19th century. In the end, a network of tunnels more than 2,000 kilometers long remained, on 3 levels, beneath Odesa, so much so that it actually served as a nuclear shelter during the Cold War, in case a nuclear conflict had occurred. In other words, we're talking about a situation that makes the city, well, quite a significant military operation to capture.
Es una operación militar de cierta envergadura. Bueno, en 2014 se produce el golpe de Estado en Maidán.
Well, in 2014, the coup d'etat took place in Maidan. And well, we all know what happened. Of course, the Russian language was completely suppressed. All expressions of Russian culture were repressed, and the statues of Pushkin, Tolstoy, Catherine II, José de Rivas, Potemkin, and everything that represented something Russian were removed, right? And, in addition, one of the cruelest events occurred, something the clique in Kiev has refused to investigate, namely, the killing and burning alive of about 48 pro-Russian people who had taken refuge in the trade union's house, some of them finished off on the ground after falling from the windows.
Algunas de ellas rematadas en el suelo cuando caían de las ventanas. 2 de mayo de 2014.
On May 2nd, 2014, in case anyone doesn't remember, I'll also say that some of the ringleaders of that have already been eliminated, and I hope that universal justice, karma, and everything else act accordingly. Odesa was the route used for the transit of Russian troops heading to Transnistria. Transnistria, as you know, is a border area between Ukraine and Moldova that is pro-Russian, while they consider themselves Russian. There is, de facto, a Soviet-style republic there, the Soviet Republic of Transnistria. And after the conflicts, like in the 1990s, a Russian peacekeeping unit was established there, whose rotation took place through Odesa.
La rotación se hacía a través de Odesa. Claro, a partir del golpe de Estado de 2014.
Of course, after the 2014 coup d'etat, the Kiev regime no longer allowed the transit of those troops and fortified the border, which made it difficult for the Kremlin to support those units stationed in Transnistria. It should also be said that Transnistria houses a large stockpile of weapons and ammunition from the Soviet era, the largest in Europe, which is why Ukraine wants it, of course. That's why the Kiev regime wants it. This makes it a critical point, one of those that, over the past 3 years, we have always been watching closely in case some source of instability or armed conflict might arise there, opening a second front in Ukraine and forcing the Russian Federation to expand its operations even further, logically reaching as far as Moldova. Well, starting in 2014, Odesa has undergone a forced Ukrainianization. As I mentioned, Ukrainian symbols were placed all over a city with a predominantly Russian cultural majority. And, well, we've seen a whole series of naval operations, how the Ukrainian fleet was destroyed, but they've used all kinds of unmanned boats, a mosquito fleet created to try to harass the Russian Black Sea Fleet. And that's more or less what has been happening. It's also important to understand that 40% of Ukraine's exports, including most of its grain, leave through the port of Odesa. Therefore, this is essential for the Ukrainian economy, and in fact, the blockade carried out by the Russian fleet aimed to strangle Ukraine's economy through that blockade. As of today, well, aside from that mosquito fleet, military control over the Black Sea belongs to the Russian Navy. What has happened recently that we could say changes a bit the circumstances surrounding the issue of Odesa? Well, Ukraine, given the situation of the conflict and always seeking a greater provocation that might somehow facilitate the intervention of NATO, the Europeans, and the United States, has begun attacking Russian civilian and oil ships in the Black Sea. Of course, what they call the shadow fleet. That is, let's clarify this as well, because the Western media swarm does nothing but lie constantly. There is no such thing as a shadow fleet. They call it the shadow fleet, those civilian ships engaged in international trade, transport vessels, oil tankers, and so on, that aren't insured by British companies, by Lloyd's, which are the ones that handle ship insurance. In other words, they're insured by companies from India, Singapore, Russia, or wherever. But since they're not under the control of Lloyd's or other Western companies, of course, they can't guarantee that the ship is actually insured. It's going to be exaggerated, and so they call it the shadow fleet. This is just another little lie from those people. It's not worth much. Well, these ships from the shadow fleet are attacked, an outright provocation. And then, well, what's Russia's response? Putin even mentions it in some statement. Basically, he lays it out in 3 points, right? First, that Russia could attack ships in Ukrainian ports, which it's already doing in the port of Odesa, the largest one. The next would be to cut off Ukraine's access to the sea. Cutting off Ukraine's access to the sea means a blockade that can be done by mining with submarines, by blocking it, or finally, if there's no other option left, by launching an assault and taking the city, the capture of Odesa.
Iniciar un asalto y tomar la ciudad, la toma de Odesa. Eso sería un poco
That would be somewhat the Russian response to this kind of provocation against civilian ships in the Black Sea. Something that, it must be said, goes against maritime law, international law, and the laws of war, among others. No one should think this is legitimate, because it seems that things are being accepted here that under any other circumstances would clearly be grounds for accusations of war crimes. But since it's being done by the Kiev regime, the green aphid thief and his Brussels clique, it seems that everything is allowed. But this is the reality. Well, let's say that the capture of Odesa would practically be seen as a logical, strategic conclusion to this kind of action. So indeed one could raise that question, well, not so much a question as the plan that Ezequiel Bistoletti mentioned. There is a plan by Russia to at a certain point take Odesa. Now, anyone familiar with how a general staff operates can be sure that right now there is not just one, but several plans to take Odesa. Whether they will actually be carried out is another matter, but that such plans exist and have been studied, you can be certain of that. Absolutely certain. Now, would that be the most advisable course of action at this moment?
¿Sería lo más aconsejable en estos momentos? No lo sé, porque va en función de las negociaciones.
I don't know, because it depends on political negotiations, and that largely determines what can be done. From a military point of view, well, it's not easy to storm a city with more than 1 million inhabitants, fortified since 2022, even though, let's say, it obviously comes under heavy attack. And lately, for example, the air defense doesn't seem to have much capacity or isn't performing very well. But even so, it's still a large, fortified city, with that whole network of tunnels we've mentioned, which can make things difficult. But it's doable. We also have to understand that. Juan Antonio, sorry.
También hay que entender que
Juan Antonio, perdón, el ataque contra el ferry en Odesa.
This is the attack on the ferry in Odessa, with which Russia responded to the attacks on the oil tankers. That spectacular image of a Geran flying at very low altitude until it hit the ferry. Sorry for the interruption, but yes, no, it's fine. This video is really good. Afterwards, the ferry was completely destroyed. And if I remember correctly, it was transporting diesel engines, something extremely important, given the state of the electrical infrastructure. Now, the ships carrying diesel engines to replace power generation are also being attacked.
The destruction of the port is going to end up being systematic until there isn't a single crane or anything left. They're going to neutralize the port, which is the first thing Putin mentioned. It would mean attacking ships in the port itself until it's rendered useless, until no ship says, I'm not going there because most likely a missile will hit me. So, in a way, you're establishing a blockade. But anyway, as I was saying, the defense of Odessa, well, the French said they were going to send 20,000 or 30,000 troops there to defend Odessa. The French parliament rejected it, so none of that is happening. There are some mercenaries and Air Force personnel acting as advisors, but nothing more. In the end, there's nothing that could stop a Russian advance on Odessa, except for Ukraine's own reserve troops, which would have to be pulled from other parts of the front to defend the city. That's it. This is the reality. So, well, in terms of strategic importance, we've mentioned it briefly. It's huge. First, it would deprive Ukraine of its main port, cutting off one of the critical routes through which supplies arrive, both by road to Odessa and the rest of Ukraine, and through the port itself. Geopolitical importance. Look, Odessa is already the city and the region, the Odessa Oblast, controlling Ukraine's access to the Black Sea. If that falls, Ukraine loses its access to the sea.
Si eso cae, Ucrania se queda sin salida al mar. Y también se quedaría sin la desembocadura del río Dnieper.
And it would also lose the mouth of the Dnieper River. In addition, it would allow the Russian army to reach Transnistria, which would not only secure the Soviet Republic of Transnistria, but would also put pressure on Moldova, whose population is mostly pro-Russian. That, however, is not reflected in the elections, because the Moldovan diaspora, controlled from the West and without sending ballots to Russia, ends up winning the elections by a very narrow margin, against the military's opinion and that of the Moldovans who remain in the country.
En contra de la opinión mayoritaria de los moldavos que están en el país, lo cual sería una presión para esa
which would put pressure on that pro-Russian majority, meaning that Moldova, with its socially pro-Russian majority, would logically see its sovereign wish unfulfilled. But in addition, this would make it possible, at a given moment, to reach the Hungarian border and therefore the European center of the Balkans. Moreover, if Ukraine loses its access to the sea, it would immediately become an unviable state. It could not survive. It could not survive. Everything would have to come through a few roads on the Polish border that pass through tunnels that are also going to be blown up.
La frontera polaca que pasen por unos túneles gigantes que también van a ser volados. O sea, ¿cómo van a hacer?
How are they going to do it? Military importance. Well, if it loses access to the sea, we already know there won't be a Ukrainian navy, nor will there be attacks with unmanned remote-controlled vessels, as has been happening recently, for example, the attacks on oil tankers. That would disappear. In addition, the Russian army would be very close to NATO bases in the Black Sea, in Romania and Bulgaria, which would also exert significant pressure from a military standpoint. And, of course, it would give Crimea and the Sevastopol base complete security. So the military importance is considerable. Ultimately, if we look at what is happening and take into account the geopolitical, military, and operational importance, it is not surprising to think that in some way the Russian General Staff's plans include resolving that issue. Almost certainly. Now then, what scenarios might we face? The one that seems most likely right now, given the current circumstances in which a peace treaty is being discussed. That peace treaty should lead to a regime change in Kiev, a constitutional change. That constitutional change would once again recognize Russian as an official language, respect for the culture, the Orthodox religion, and so on. That is to say, the boot that now oppresses the citizens of Odesa would be lifted. Citizens who are Russian, who have always considered themselves Russian, and who live in fear under the terror of a regime that was imposed there by force, as we mentioned earlier with the burning of the trade union's house. It was imposed by force because they were ready to declare the People's Republic of Odessa, just as Donetsk and Luhansk had declared theirs. But all of that was brutally suppressed. So what could happen once that peace treaty, that regime change, that constitutional change, and so on, were established? That Russia, or rather from Russia, a referendum might be promoted in the Odessa Oblast and in the Nikolaev Oblast, the region right next to it, historically Russian regions, as the Kremlin has declared. Then, it's among their objectives. This could happen, and it would be the most acceptable way. Why? Because it would prevent the damage caused by fighting, battles, bombings, and so on, both to the city and to the infrastructure itself, which is expensive. For example, the destruction of bridges. Those bridges will have to be rebuilt someday, and we're not talking, anyone who knows how these things work knows this, we're not talking about a few little bridges. These are bridges with heavy traffic, they have to be very strong, and, well, that's costly engineering. So, well, this would be perhaps the plan that the Kremlin might currently have in mind. That is to say, once things calm down a bit more, we'll see what happens in the regions of Sumy, Kharkiv, Dnipro, Mykolaiv, and Odessa. Another option, logically, is a military assault. In that case, there are two possibilities. The most likely one would be that, as the Ukrainian front's ability to resist keeps weakening, forces would cross the Dnipro River toward Kherson, from Kherson to Mykolaiv, and then turn toward Odessa to take Odessa by land. That would perhaps be the most feasible option. Why? For a very simple reason. Because if you take it from land, and by militarily controlling the Black Sea, you have it under siege. That is, from that point on, and not only that, not only do you have it surrounded, but you are also just a few kilometers from the border with Transnistria. And on top of that, you cut off the entire southern part of the Odessa Oblast, which is where the port of Izmail, the Danube, and so on are located, the border with Romania, and so forth. It could also be done, depending on the deterioration of the Ukrainian army's combat capabilities, through an assault with amphibious and other supported forces. Maybe not with the intention of taking the entire city and all its facilities, but at least the port, And if you take the port away from Odesa, the city is very beautiful, but that's it. Operationally, it's over. It's over. In other words, what would they do then?
Es decir, ¿qué iban a hacer? Gastar reservas y reservas y reservas intentando recuperar el puerto.
Spend reserves and more reserves and try to retake the port. Because from the port, that is, Russian logistics will be able to expand the bridgehead and effectively take over more and more of the city and its surroundings. That is, unless they also end up landing in other areas of that oblast. That's feasible, of course, although these operations are much more costly than the one we mentioned in the first scenario, the peace treaty. Finally, there's a third option, the collapse of the front or even the collapse of the regime itself, meaning there would no longer be the capacity to continue the war. Then, at a certain point, the pro-Russian Fifth Column in Odesa would simply carry out an uprising, an insurrection, immediately supported by Russian airborne forces, leading from there to the referendum of the first scenario.
Y de ahí al referéndum del primer escenario. Referéndum, declaración de la República Popular de Odesa, referéndum y reincorporación.
Referendum, declaration of the People's Republic of Odesa, referendum, and reintegration into Russia. These would be the three most likely scenarios. I don't know if maybe someone could point out another one, but for now, these are the ones I think have the greatest chance of being carried out. What seems certain, regardless of which scenario ultimately happens, depending on events, because there will be a plan for each of these scenarios, a secret plan, is that Putin's secret plan. No, possibly there are 3 or more, or 4 or 5 plans. The issue of Odesa, I believe, will have to be resolved sooner or later. Possibly, if there are more pressing matters related to the peace treaty, the Odesa issue will be postponed, and it might be feasible to move forward with one of those plans.
Excelente tu análisis, Juan Antonio.
Excellent analysis, Juan Antonio. Military-related questions. If we were to find ourselves in a war like those before the one in Ukraine, and therefore a war without the massive introduction of drones, Russia would very likely have already launched an offensive against Odesa, given the strategic importance you also described in your analysis. In fact, if I were Putin, when choosing between Kharkiv and Odesa for the future, I would consider Odesa to be much more important than Kharkiv from a geostrategic standpoint. Of course, the war in Ukraine began, and so did the drone war, which creates enormous difficulties for large-scale operations, not only because of the drones' attack capabilities, but above all, because of their monitoring capacity.
Sino por sobre todas las cosas por la capacidad de monitorización a partir de los drones. Con muy poquito dinero pueden determinar.
With drones, and with very little money, both the Russian and Ukrainian armed forces can determine the situation at least 10 kilometers behind the front line in real time. Now, Odesa, as you rightly pointed out, is characterized, at least the southern part of Odesa, by a very particular geography. Here is the Danube River, in a way creating a natural border to the south. Here is the mouth of the Dniester. Up here is Transnistria, and here is the Black Sea, where, if not total Russian naval dominance, there is at least a situation favorable to Russia in the Black Sea.
Favoritaria a Rusia en el Mar Negro. Entonces, a pesar de los drones y a pesar de esta situación.
So, despite the drones and this situation, somehow a large part of Odesa already seems isolated, preparing the territory for an attack, perhaps amphibious, perhaps airborne, or maybe both at the same time, as you mentioned from Kherson. So the question is basically this: could these particular features of Odesa, with the Black Sea to the right, the rivers above and below, Transnistria with 2,000 Russian soldiers to the north, and the possibility of amphibious air and ground attacks, somehow compensate for the disadvantages of such an operation against the drones? Or not even that?
A ver, es que el tema de la guerra de drones.
Look, the thing about drone warfare is that its main effect is that it imposes a very specific tempo on you. It forces slowness. That's the key point. Yes, it's true that if you expose a lot of equipment and your troops under a sky full of drones, you're obviously going to suffer many casualties. So, what you do when you want to minimize casualties, Because in a war of attrition, the goal is to increase the enemy's losses and reduce your own, is just that. The argument is that simple. It's about minimizing my losses and maximizing the enemy's. Minimizing my losses means that when the sky is full of drones, it's not because those drones are some kind of spectacular weapon or anything like that.
No es porque esos drones sean un arma espectacular y demás, y muchas veces para destruir un vehículo blindado tienen que usar 8 y 10 drones.
Many times, to destroy an armored vehicle, they have to use 8 or 10 drones, otherwise you can't disable it. That is, first they detect your presence, and second, they start pecking at you with that swarm of little drones, which means you're exposed to a high number of casualties. If you want to minimize those casualties, you can't wage a maneuver war or carry out a deep operation, as would be desirable. This has changed things, both in terms of drones and in terms of time. In the end, you'll do the same thing, but with small units that infiltrate, look for the right moment, and move faster, whether on motorcycles, bikes. Well, and lately we've even seen cavalry. It's no joke.
Bueno, y últimamente hemos visto caballería. No es ninguna tontería. Tú tienes un pelotón a caballo y vas a...
You have a cavalry unit, and you're going to cover the 1.5 miles to the enemy position on horseback, and you'll get there much faster than on foot, with a sky full of drones. In short, the idea is to increase. That is, if the drone slows you down, you have to increase your speed of advance to minimize as much as possible the damage the drones can cause you. All this while waiting for some kind of electronic warfare system to appear that can neutralize them. Neutralize the enemy's yours, but ultimately neutralize the drone space. That could also happen at any moment. But let's assume that indeed we're in the current circumstances, which is what needs to be analyzed. And then you say, well, all right, so when would be the right moment?
¿Cuándo sería el momento adecuado? Bueno, pues cuando la capacidad de...
Well, when your drone capacity and your ability to move forward at a certain speed are much greater than the enemy's, the enemy will still have drones and will be able to launch them at you. But of course, it's not the same if in an advanced zone they have 2,000 drones instead of 200. With 200, you might already send some armored units forward, and if you move at good speed and have control of the roads and so on, you might make progress, maybe even some deep advances. Perhaps that point hasn't been reached yet, although we have seen operations speeding up already in Zaporizhia, where there are no longer major fortified lines, so the advance tends to be much faster.
Entonces ya el avance suele ser mucho más rápido. En un momento determinado sí que se puede calibrar.
At a certain point, it can indeed be assessed, and I believe that if an assault were to take place, it would be a combined arms assault. For example, there would likely be amphibious landings at specific points, an advance by land, diversionary operations, and the deployment of troops from another direction in order to create some chaos in the Ukrainian rear. Although I imagine the Ukrainians have their plans prepared for such circumstances, that is war. In the end, it will come down to how reserves and weapon systems can be allocated for an offensive of this kind. But look, what must be kept in mind is that the objective, the center of gravity, is the port of Odesa and the mouth of the Dniester.
Y la desembocadura del Dniester. Esos son los centros de gravedad.
Those are the centers of gravity. If you take the port of Odesa as a bridgehead and the mouth of the Dniester, the rest is just expanding the bridgehead, but you've already cut off their routes. In other words, the disaster here would already be done. You'd already have control. Because where there's no port, you can't bring in a ship of thousands of tons full of equipment and unload it there by forming a chain and carrying the packages on your back. That is, if there's no deep water port, it's over. It's over. So either the port could end up being destroyed by bombings, or it could be taken at a certain point through an operation with transported troops, amphibious landings, or something similar. A complex operation could be carried out, but it's doable.
Pero se puede realizar. No iba a ser una operación secreta, porque inmediatamente...
It wasn't going to be a secret operation, because drones and satellite systems would immediately detect the movement. The question is whether you'll be able to mobilize enough resources to try and stop the operation, because maybe you no longer have them. What's already happening in some parts of the front, that when you want to launch a counterattack to regain some ground, like in Kupiansk, you find yourself leaving the Kharkiv or Sumy region unprotected, and other Russian forces start advancing there. And this could happen at any moment in the Odesa region as well. Now, I think that moment hasn't come yet. They would still wait for a further deterioration in the combat capability of Ukrainian troops. And of NATO, how many pontoon bridges can they supply here?
And one more question, Juan Antonio, also of a military nature. Obviously, if Russia could, it would carry out ground operations from Transnistria. It cannot, due to the number of troops, apparently between 1,500 and 2,000, according to the latest publicly available information.
It could be even more, huh?
Maybe more. Apparently, both drone production and recruitment have begun in that region, not for direct combat, but for military support tasks. Now, about this, last Wednesday Fernando and I were discussing it, and the decision not to carry out operations from there would be due to the fact that that number of soldiers, even a bit more, still couldn't, at least up to now, effectively respond to a Ukrainian advance. That region holds a huge arsenal, with an enormous amount of ammunition, though the exact quantity is not publicly known. No one can determine it precisely, but it's certainly very large. So at least that was Fernando's analysis last Wednesday. Russia isn't launching an offensive from there because it would have more to lose than to gain, right?
I believe the troops stationed in Transnistria could reach 4,000, because the arrival of many Russian tourists in the area has been detected. They might reach 4,000, but they have one main function, which is to defend that arsenal. The defense of that arsenal is essential. That arsenal is essential. And I imagine there might even be a plan at some point for it to fall into the hands of those who could blow it up.
How possible is this? That's precisely one of the questions we discussed with Fernando last Wednesday. How possible is it to secretly introduce Russian soldiers into Transnistria? By air, obviously they can't, because of Moldova's control of its airspace and the possibility of interception in the case of airborne troops. Well, that's too complicated. But covertly, couldn't Russia send people there in some other way?
That has arrived. It's been little by little. For now, it's been little by little. Naturally, you can go in plain clothes without any problem because they have everything there to give you a uniform, arm you, and so on. There's no issue. The arsenal is immense. I think that's probably been reinforced drop by drop through a trickle of tourists, travelers, that sort of thing. At a certain point, a somewhat daring operation would indeed be possible, taking advantage of certain weather conditions and massive bombings to send in 4 or 5 units and bring in another 1,000 or 2,000 troops. Risky, of course, but that's how war is. That is, at some point you'll have to support those troops who are already there and could end up surrounded. On the other hand, I think that, from Moldova's perspective, regarding the European Union and NATO, reigniting that conflict in Transnistria would be a handicap, because you're not going to bring into the EU or NATO another country that's already in an armed conflict. Also, it would mean, well, it would effectively mean a direct confrontation with NATO, and then there would be no problem reaching Transnistria for sure, because missiles of another kind would start flying. So no, I think they tried it at the time, carried out some operations, even terrorist attacks in Transnistria in 2022, but for some reason the operation and the Ukrainians gave up on the idea because I think it wasn't viable.
En última instancia no tiene viabilidad porque la...
Ultimately, it wasn't viable because the Russian response would logically also be the provocation to launch the assault on Odessa. You have to deal with the situation of the Russian units stationed in Transnistria. So, well, if the route to Transnistria goes through Odessa, then you go ahead and launch it. Of course, you have no other choice, no matter the cost, no matter the casualties. From the very beginning of the special military operation, some of us said, Russia will win this for a very simple reason.
Esto lo ganará Rusia por una razón muy sencilla. Porque está dispuesta a poner medio millón de muertos.
Because he is willing to put 500,000 dead on the table. And other countries are not. And Moldova can't. And Romania can't. And I won't even mention Western Europe. It can't. It doesn't want to, and it doesn't know how. So look, at a certain point, until now, the issue of casualties has been very carefully shielded. That's also why progress is so slow. That's why there are no deep or large-scale maneuver operations. Why? Because the goal is to minimize the number of casualties.
¿Por qué? Porque lo que se intenta es minimizar el número de bajas. Y hay que minimizarlas por una razón muy sencilla. No es una cuestión.
And they must be minimized for a very simple reason. It's not a humanitarian issue of saying, let's have as few deaths as possible. It's not a humanitarian issue. It means that you have to keep your replacement rate positive. In other words, you must be able to maintain the front. And for that, if you have X casualties, you need X plus a certain percentage to replace them. At the moment when that becomes impossible, which is what's happening right now to the troops in Kiev, you start losing the war, and then it's only a matter of time. So no, you have to maintain that replacement rate. And what Russia is trying to do is keep it up without even resorting to a general mobilization. It's as if mobilization had taken place in Ukraine 3 years ago. We've seen the images of people being grabbed off the streets. In fact, that hasn't happened in Russia, and it's not going to happen. But of course, that can impose a limitation. That is, to keep your replacement rate positive, you have to minimize casualties. You can't afford to say, well, we've launched a very successful offensive.
De esas de decir, hombre, hemos lanzado una ofensiva muy exitosa, eso sí, hemos tenido 25,000 bajas, hombre.
That said, we've had 25,000 casualties. In other words, that's complicated when you don't want to go into full mobilization. You have to understand how operations are carried out, designed, and planned, because it's a complex issue, depending on the goals you want to achieve, the resources you have, and your ability to sustain a war of attrition within the parameters you want to maintain. Obviously, if everything here were to blow up and the number of casualties no longer mattered, well, then yes, Russia would mobilize its 9 million reservists, and we'd see an avalanche like in World War II.
Y tendríamos una avalancha como en la Segunda Guerra Mundial. Sí, a lo mejor se han perdido en una batalla.
Yes, maybe 300,000 men have been lost in a battle. But I assure you they're at the Hungarian border. Because then casualties wouldn't matter anymore. Drones wouldn't matter either. Look, most drones are low-caliber artillery. We're talking about explosive grenades of 2 kilos, 5 kilos. It's low-caliber artillery, yes. Very precise. But come on, with today's battlefield management systems, an artillery piece also knows exactly where to place the shell. And maybe it's 35 kilos. And I'm not even talking about missiles or thermobaric weapon systems. I mean, we have to understand that drones have changed warfare. Well, not that they changed it, no.
Los drones han cambiado la guerra. Bueno, cambió la guerra, no. Imponen unas condiciones en las cuales tú tienes que replanificar.
It imposes conditions under which you have to replan how a campaign is carried out, taking that variable into account. Taking that variable into account to achieve what you want, to minimize your casualties, right? So you can continue the war as long as necessary without resorting to general mobilization. And what's the trade-off for that? Time. You'll have to move very slowly, because your advances will be 500 meters, a kilometer, 2 kilometers, maybe 10 kilometers long, and one day you might advance 20-something kilometers in one area. 20-something kilometers, that's quite a lot, An area sown with drones. And then you know how minefields are laid nowadays. Well, it's no longer like before, when mines were placed one by one.
Es decir, ya no es como antes que se iba colocando una mina o otra mina. Es decir, ahora hay sistemas de sembrado de los campos de mina.
Now there are systems to plant minefields. All of that creates difficulties. And in fact, right now the Ukrainian forces are mainly focused, aside from where they try to carry out some operation for public relations purposes, on trying to slow down the Russian advance. For them, and it should be understood this way because it's true, for them, the fact that the Russian army is moving slowly is already a victory. That is, of course, they can't do anything else. At least they can gain as much time as possible, hoping something happens that changes the situation. That's where the provocations come from. That's where the clashes within the Western Bloc come from when it comes to maintaining the war or moving toward a peace treaty or whatever. Why? Because nothing has been decided, and there's no exit plan, no plan B. There never was one. What can the Ukrainian General Staff do? Well, slow down. Slow down the Russian advance as much as possible, hoping for some final solution to the issue, whether it's a peace treaty or a NATO intervention, which would be madness. But still, they're thinking about it, because there's nothing else they can do now. With the resources they have, there's nothing else possible. As for the operation around Odesa, I'm sure one of the scenarios we've discussed will happen. We can't know which one yet, but there are already signs showing that Russian patience is running out regarding the issue of not allowing continued harassment of civilian ships in the Black Sea, which means the port, the Dniester estuary, and that area will be pounded and eventually taken. I don't know how, but it will be taken. And logically, if there isn't a peace treaty beforehand and things reach that point, Ukraine will end up as a practically unviable state. Because, think about it, if the only thing it had in that area was agriculture and the grain left through the ports, and the mouths of the Dniester, the Dnieper, and the Black Sea beaches are cut off, then only the roads leading to Poland remain. And the Poles aren't very happy about Ukrainian grain entering the European Union through Poland because of other political and economic issues related to agriculture.
Regarding the political situation in Ukraine, there are some updates, Juan Antonio, and I'd like your overall view. The first interesting piece of news: an interview given by presidential advisor Podolyak. Here's the interview in Ukrainian. It's striking that Podolyak always appears wearing that hooded sweatshirt, always dressed that way in every interview. Strange, but anyway, what's the main statement, the most important declaration? Basically this: Ukraine doesn't have the resources to hold elections. We have a deficit, therefore we can't hold elections with our own money. If elections are to be held, hence the little European Union flag in the background, Europeans will have to pay for them. First element for analysis, Podolyak's interview today. Second interesting element, well, this one not so much for analysis, but this book published very recently by, bless you.
Publicado hace muy poquito por ahí en la primera línea comienza el libro.
In the very first line, the book begins with a display of patriotism from Zaluzhny. I will not abandon Kyiv in the event of an invasion. I will die fighting and be the last to leave it. Well, how brave, what a statement. Here are photos of Zaluzhny himself, also from today, where instead of resisting the Russian invasion, he's in the Dominican Republic. Juan Antonio, right? Much nicer, surely, isn't it? This time of year, sunshine, beach.
Solcito, playa, Caribe. Bueno,
Caribbean. Well, another issue for analysis, another element, the participation of other unacceptable figures as well, because just as Zelensky is unacceptable, Zaluzhny is too. And a third element for domestic policy analysis, the 20 points finally drafted by the working group Circle, made up of Kushner, Vitkov, and the Ukrainian negotiators in the United States. If I remember correctly, that was the main number. Finally, those points were completed. Instead of 28, There are now 20, also delusional, even more delusional than the original plan. And on this basis then, this Sunday, supposedly, the announcement, a meeting between Trump and Zelensky is planned. What's your analysis, Juan Antonio, of the current situation of the back and forth in these negotiations?
Sí, lo de Salud no tiene mayor comentario. Es decir,
There's not much to say about Zaluzhny. I mean, he's one of those shameless comrades from Kiev. And well, he wants to be the caliph instead of the caliph, and hey, he's enjoying a well-deserved vacation, right? I mean, they sent him as ambassador to London, and now he's off to the Dominican Republic on vacation to the Caribbean beaches. Interestingly, about the Dominican Republic, Ezequiel, there are also many politicians in Spain who all go to the Dominican Republic. Someday we'll have to talk about why they go there. It's not a trivial matter. It's not because those are the most beautiful beaches in the Caribbean, because it's the Dominican Republic, and there are reasons for that. Anyway, that would be a topic for another conversation. About the elections, we don't have any money. We'll need a 90-day ceasefire to be able to organize the elections and so on and so forth. The 20 points. These are the 20 points we came up with. In other words, the mountain gave birth to a mouse. And so they decided on those 20 points, the ones he presented to Witkoff and Ed Carner, to the New York Real Estate Association, and that he's now going to present to Trump. All of this is nothing but maneuvers to buy time. It doesn't mean anything else. Let's be serious.
No tiene otro sentido. Vamos a ver. Seamos serios. If
the United States, which is the most important belligerent party, because if it weren't for the United States, this war would have ended a long time ago, then the most important belligerent party and the one Russia really has to negotiate with is the United States. All the others are dwarfs, mice. They're mice. You give them a broom swipe and that's it. That's it. Period. They don't matter. We see Macron making a fool of himself again, saying that although one must talk to Putin, this time they won't give him a 15-meter table. They'll give him a little table on one side of Red Square and Putin on the other side. In other words, they're ridiculous. They don't matter. And neither does Zelensky's regime. Because everything depends on Western aid. Absolutely everything. How is he gonna decide? How are Zelensky and his circle gonna decide? How are they gonna decide? How? What, are they gonna impose conditions on whom? On Wyckoff and Trump and the rest? Are they gonna impose them? How? Let them tell me how. So let's stop speculating, because every so-called expert analyst out there makes my hair stand on end. I mean, let's stop speculating. All of this only has one purpose, to buy time. If the main belligerent party, which is the United States, has already reached a preliminary agreement, not that it's been approved, far from it, there are still loose ends and many details that need to be discussed. But at least there's a base document to talk about, which has 28 points, is divided into 4 other documents, and has already been agreed upon by Dmitriev, Wyckoff, Skarsgård, and that other guy from the Pentagon who went and presented it to Zelensky. I mean, if it's already been discussed, how is some guy who has nothing to do with it going to show up now? Just because he was told to by others who matter even less than he does, like Ursula, Callas, and that whole bunch. How are they going to go and say, Donald, not the 28 points, but the 20 I'm bringing? Come on. First of all, that's not serious. It's just not serious. If it's already been agreed that we're starting from a base document with 28 points, these ones, you can't just change the negotiation and tell me they're going to give me another 20. Because that simply means you don't want to negotiate. Basically, what you're saying is that you're just stalling, as we say in Spain, to avoid doing anything, to avoid moving forward, right? That's what you're doing, buying time. And why buy time? Because among the European elites, including the United Kingdom and the American neocons, there's hope of reaching the U.S. midterm elections. and that in those elections, Donald Trump will lose Congress, lose the Senate, and that an impeachment process could even begin to remove Trump from office. And then everything would go back to how it was before, with Joe Biden in charge. That's the time they want to gain. And that's why Trump is in such a hurry, because he has to do whatever he needs to do before those midterm elections to be able to sell it as a success and avoid defeat. That's the plan.
Evitar la derrota. Ese es el esquema. Y estos, bueno, pues ganan tiempo, intentan ganar tiempo, intentan ganar tiempo.
And these people, well, they're buying time, trying to buy time, trying to buy time. Hey, and if there's nothing to be done in the midterm elections, at least there's the hope of keeping things going to see if they can make it to the next U.S. elections. And since Trump can't run, maybe the occupant of the White House changes and a window of opportunity opens. That's what they're after, how to keep the conflict going until 2028. In fact, the famous 90 billion euros in loans that the European fools will pay for, all those who voted for this bunch of crooks in their respective European countries are the ones who will foot the bill for the 90 billion euros to sustain Ukraine in 2026-2027, hoping to keep the situation going until the U.S. presidency changes.
Hasta que cambie la presidencia norteamericana. Ese es el único sentido. Porque si lo piensas...
That's the only point. Because if you think about it, let's see, you can't set conditions. First, Ukrainian law doesn't say anything about presidential elections not being allowed under martial law. It says nothing. Mr. Zelensky stopped being a legitimate president many months ago. According to the Ukrainian Republican Constitution, the person who would now hold representational authority is the president of the Rada, not Zelensky. But no, he's still there, clinging to his seat, like the whole clique, except for those who have already fled. Second, the Ukrainian Constitution does not forbid elections under martial law. And in any case, if that were the situation, it should be the president of the Rada who represents the country.
Tercero, 90 días para organizar unas elecciones.
Third, 90 days to organize elections. Well, sure, but what do you want? What you really want is for everyone abroad to vote. They've set up a whole operation right now to decide who's going to be president. So 90 days and everyone else just waiting. And of course, you want a 90-day ceasefire, right? So you can hold elections. Come on, that's not serious. But what's even less serious is what I mentioned. If there's already a plan, a 28-point base document that's been discussed and agreed upon with the Americans since Alaska, you can't keep changing it every other day. Not long ago, they presented another document when this whole bunch met in London. They just keep presenting documents. What for? To slow down the negotiations, the discussions. Now he's going to Washington to pester Trump, now with his little paper of 20 points. And I don't know what Trump will do. What I'd feel like saying is, come on, really, you again with this? Again. And now you'll leave here and come back in 2 or 3 weeks with another little paper, now with 18 points. Or 23, right? Because Starmer told you, Macron too, they were all on the train, the little handkerchief, the teaspoon and all that, and now you end up with 23 points. It's just not serious. I mean, how can Vukov show up before Putin in the Kremlin and say, no, Vladimir, it's not 28 anymore. Zelensky asked us for a document with 20 points, right? And now we're going to talk about these 20 points. Well, normally President Putin would say, look, Steve, let's have a vodka, you get on the plane and go back home. It's not serious. It's not serious. And what this shows is that there's no intention to negotiate or to stop the war. Kiev hasn't supported the European Union and the United Kingdom by backing Kiev, have no intention of stopping the war. That's the reality. And they have the complicity of the American neocons. And there, Trump does what he can. And who does he rely on? He relies on the people he trusts. Who are they? The New York real estate bosses, the ones who always get him work. Of course. Who else would it be? Can he trust Marco Rubio?
¿Se puede fiar de Marco Rubio? No se puede fiar de Marco Rubio. ¿Desconvencen?
You can't trust Marco Rubio. Scott Besson, the shadiest guy in the White House. Who can you trust then? Peter Hedges, who doesn't even know what he bombed in Nigeria. Who can you trust? This is Trump's fault for meeting with and surrounding himself with lowlifes. But fine, that's how it is. Maybe he had no other choice, otherwise he might not have become president. I don't know, really, but that's the reality. So, well, this is just another maneuver, and we're going to see more of these. And of course, they'll be looking for a provocation that might end up pushing the Russians into an overreaction, so they can say, see what a threat they are? Let's start the war. This is what they're after. Buying time and provoking. Buying time and provoking. There's no other point to it, because it shows how unserious the whole thing is. Completely unserious. I mean, look at the fuss they made over those 28 points. They shoved them into every publication, in the press, on television. The 28 points. The 28 points. Oh, the 28 points have already been agreed on. There's already a base document to start from. A Pentagon official, a Secretary of the Army, is going to present them to Zelensky here, and so on and so on and so on. And now they're telling us again that Zelensky has come up with a little paper with 20 points. But what is this? What is this? I mean, these are the serious people who run countries in the European Union. This is how serious these people are. How much is their word worth? Less than nothing. Well, a few billion euros. What's going on? So there's only one way to read this. Obviously, I don't know if they'll fool Trump, if Zelensky, the comedian-in-chief, will fool him or whatever. But if they go to Moscow with those 20 points Zelensky has on that piece of paper, there won't be any negotiation, right? We can already say it. There won't be any negotiation, and the war will go on, and Odesa will fall.
Bien, para redondear Ucrania, Juan Antonio...
Well, to wrap up on Ukraine, Juan Antonio, and in line with your analysis of the massive corruption within the Ukrainian political regime, here's simply a quick look at an article, actually, an interview, published by the New York Post, a conservative New York newspaper linked to Trumpism, in which an old acquaintance of ours, dear Juan Antonio, Mr. Hunter Biden himself, describes Ukraine as a nest of vipers. Let's remember Ukraine's involvement in shady deals and corruption through Burisma Holdings. It was a complete mistake. I was very naive about how hellish Ukraine is. What a level of corruption. Still astonishing. These are the words of Mr. Hunter Biden.
El señor Hunter Biden.
Which is already quite something, huh?
For him to say that, oh dear, well, this is like walking into a prison gallery and saying, yeah, as if the worst inmates of all were scared of another criminal, right?
No, it was the prisoners watching television. And a prime minister shows up, and they all get scared, saying, but come on, how can that be? How can they be such thieves? They're all in there for robbing banks.
Cambiando de tema...
Changing the subject, here's Nicolás Maduro's Christmas message, all courtesy of our friendly and brother channel, Guerras y Geopolítica, a Telegram channel. Therefore, anyone who wants real-time information, practically in Spanish, shouldn't miss it. Everyone is invited to subscribe to that channel, Guerras y Geopolítica, a very good Spanish-language geopolitics channel on Telegram. This is Maduro's Christmas message.
Aquí nos forjamos nosotros, entre los corredores.
Here is where we were forged, among the corridors. There, beside the people, among the drums of Mandinga, of Ricardo, and of Grupo Madera, who raised their voices of rebellion and their songs forever. This is the land of saints, of wise people, of brave patriots, like José Gregorio Hernández, like St. Carmen Rendelis, and like the neighbors of every commune, of every community, who now write and sing their own song. We have been endowed by God with a good and victorious soul. That is why listening to this melody is a blessing that life offers us. a voice full of truth and optimism. Like the boy, like the girl born today under the Star of Bethlehem, who says that the song of our people, Silita, invites us to feel proud to live in this time full of challenges and new possibilities.
Lleno de desafíos y de nuevas posibilidades.
Bueno,
Juan Antonio, any news? This thing with the kids dancing is something very, very common, not only in Venezuela, but also in Colombia and the Caribbean countries. Since they're little, kids dance naturally, and they dance salsa and tropical rhythms really well. A very beautiful tradition throughout that whole region. Juan Antonio, any news here in Venezuela?
Juan Antonio, novedades aquí en Venezuela.
Sí, bueno, vamos a comentar alguna cosa. Lo primero es...
Yes, well, let's talk about a few things. First of all, the other day I was talking with a colleague, and of course for us cold Castilians, this seemed a bit, I don't know, kind of tacky, populist, right? But the truth is that people there feel drawn to that way of doing things, don't they? For example, Nicolás Maduro's style. Chavez was a bit like that too, wasn't he? And many...
Chavez dancing well, that's the difference. And singing very well too.
Eso es cierto. Pero bueno, que es muy propio de...
Yes, that's the difference, that's true. But well, it's very typical of the region. I mean, possibly if I were there, I'd look ridiculous. But of course, I'm a product of the Castilian plateau, colder than... Well, I just don't see myself in that. But I understand that people do see themselves reflected in that way of expressing things. And hey, if that works and helps get the message, the guidelines, and the slogan across to people, then fine. Everyone has their own way. About Venezuela, there's a piece of news that went almost unnoticed from December 9th, in which the Bank of England had to load onto a plane the 31 tons of gold that had been deposited there by the Central Bank of Venezuela and return them to Caracas.
Del Banco de Venezuela, el Banco Central de Venezuela, y las ha devuelto a Caracas. Ha sido un proceso largo, de 4 años.
It's been a long process, 4 years, no, 5 years. It began in July 2020, when a British High Court ruled that the gold belonging to the Central Bank of Venezuela, held at the Bank of England, should be handed over to the interim president. Remember that Guaido? And that only Guaido's representatives could access that gold. Naturally, the Venezuelan state appealed that ruling, because after all, the gold belongs to the Central Bank of Venezuela, not to Guaido or even to Maduro. It belongs to the Central Bank of Venezuela. It belongs to the Venezuelan people. This reminds us of other cases. And well, in December 2021, the Court of Appeals ordered a new trial.
En julio de 2022, el Tribunal Superior...
In July 2022, the High Court of the United Kingdom ruled that Guaido did not have de facto control over the Central Bank of Venezuela and therefore could not dispose of the gold. Otherwise, they would have spent it, right? They would have stolen it. Oh well. And on November 28, 2024, the British Supreme Court issued the final ruling. The gold legally belongs to the Central Bank of Venezuela and ordered its immediate transfer, which took place by plane this past December 9th. Well, this is very important. Why? Because we must remember, well, this sets a precedent, that there are $300 billion seized by Western states, 210 billion of them by Euroclear alone in Belgium, from the funds of the Central Bank of Russia.
No solo, hay 7.000 millones de Afganistán.
Not only that, there are 7 billion from Afghanistan, 120 billion from Iran. So of course, this has led, for example, in recent years since 2020, to Western governments' behavior prompting Turkey to withdraw 220 tons of gold from Western banks, Poland 100 tons, Hungary 94 tons, Serbia 20 tons, and Kazakhstan 36 tons. In total, over 3 years, 470 tons of gold have left Western vaults for their home countries. Moreover, Italy has recently requested the repatriation of its gold from the European Central Bank. In other words, no one trusts the gang anymore. The Alibaba's den in Brussels and London, no one trusts them anymore.
Nadie se fía ya. Y esto, bueno, pues mira, ha sido una victoria
And this, well, look, it's a victory for Maduro regarding this issue. It must be said that, well, I have another figure here to help understand what this has been. When the economic war began in 2017, when Juan Guaido was made interim president, the one who proclaimed himself in a square in 2019, that meant the freezing and transfer of Venezuelan assets to his name. In fact, they stole a lot. They stole a lot of what was abroad. And well, there's a study that helps us see what it means to freeze assets abroad. The accounts you have in foreign banks, and the gold deposited in banks to make international payments. There's a study from Columbia University and the London School of Economics showing that the sanctions on Venezuela between 2017 and 2018 resulted in 40,000 deaths. Why? Because those sanctions prevented the import of medicines, food, and medical equipment. And this resulted in 40,000 deaths. 40,000 more dead, whose blood is on the hands of Brussels, London, and Washington. 40,000 dead. And, well, another piece of news also related to Venezuela is the signing of an agreement with China worth $120 billion over 15 years, which marks a historic turning point. What is this agreement like? Well, it must be said that it is an agreement with the China National Petroleum Corporation. And as I said, it's $120 billion over 15 years, of which $45 billion will go to developing fields in the Orinoco Belt, and $28 billion to upgrading refineries, to increase production from 480,000 barrels of oil per day to 1.2 million. 23 billion for transportation infrastructure, highways, 24 billion for heavy crude technology, because the problem with Venezuelan oil, which is very good, is that it's very heavy and needs to be refined. It requires a specific technology for refining, which used to be done in the United States, back when the U.S. bought a large share of all the oil Venezuela exported. In exchange for what are the Chinese putting $120 billion on the table? Billions of dollars. In exchange for 800,000 barrels of oil per day that will go to China with an 8% discount and will be paid in gold-backed yuan. Some people may not understand what this means. It means that Russia has 17 billion invested in Venezuela.
Rusia tiene 17.000 millones invertidos en Venezuela. China tenía 60.000 millones invertidos en Venezuela a intereses de Turquía.
China had 60 billion invested in Venezuela, with interests from Turkey and Iran. And now this agreement with China is a strategic one, which moreover is not paid in dollars. Do we understand why the United States is so entangled in the Caribbean with the issue of Venezuela, searching for drug traffickers on every little boat they find in the Caribbean Sea? Because this is very important. It's a blow in their own backyard, as they say, right? So in the end, what do we have here? What are the implications of all this? Well, that the political neutrality of the custody of sovereign funds in other countries, in Western countries, is not secure. And therefore, this will have consequences. Maybe slowly at first, but it will bring consequences. Because before another country goes through what happened to Iran, having 120 billion seized, they will withdraw their funds. This also means that the dollar stops being indispensable in yet another country, and with already significant volumes. In other words, trade can be conducted using currencies outside the dollar. And well, the combination of Venezuela's legal victory with access to the Western judicial system and Chinese investment, which is an alternative source of financing. What happens then? That a model that can be replicated by other countries is considered valid. And this is very dangerous. At some point we've said it, the problem with Venezuela, aside from its energy sources, its resources, its metals, gold, and so on, is that it's a bad example. It's a bad example for the Americas. I don't know which other countries might decide to do the same. Of course, all this will drive the creation of parallel infrastructures within the BRICS payment system, which is already carrying out transactions, mind you, in 2024. I don't yet have the figures for 2025, but in 2024 alone, there were transactions valued at $41.1 trillion. $41.1 trillion.
41,1 billones de dólares. Y también el aumento bilateral de los países con su moneda.
And also the bilateral increase among countries using their local currencies, or at least currencies alternative to the dollar, which has risen from $420 billion in 2019 to $1.4 trillion in 2024. If we add to this the decline of the dollar, for example, over the past 25 years, global dollar reserves in central banks have fallen from 73% to 58%, and international trade conducted in dollars has dropped over the last 9 years from 80.7% to 70%. That is, if you add all this up, you realize that logically the U.S. economy has a problem, and the U.S. administration is trying to tackle that problem by any means necessary, including theft, piracy, aggression, or whatever it takes.
La agresión y lo que sea. Porque es que, claro, es que Irán es un mal ejemplo.
Because Iran is a bad example, Venezuela is a bad example, and bad examples are popping up like mushrooms all over the world. And that, of course, shows that the Western sanctions strategy has been a failure, especially in the case of Venezuela. That is, the government didn't collapse, and the only thing Venezuela did was build an alternative trade network, with Russia, lines of credit, with China, oil purchases, with Iran, fuel and technicians, with Turkey, trade, with India, oil sales as well. It's normal. Because in the end, if you run a country, it should be a sovereign and free one. Otherwise, to be vassals, well, there are already the Western Europeans, that is to say.
Por aquí un buen aporte de Marcos Argo.
Here, a good contribution from Marcos Argo regarding Milley's decision some time ago. I can't remember if it was early this year or late last year. This year, if I'm not mistaken, about sending Argentina's gold to London. Speaking of lackeys, traitors to the homeland, and bootlickers. Greetings from Fabian Esparza here. Thank you very much, Fabian. Juan Antonio, about this, I wanted to show a bit of the very good speech by Samuel Moncada, the Venezuelan representative at the United Nations, during the special session convened by Venezuela on account of the acts of piracy carried out by the United States. Basically, the seizure of 2 oil tankers and a third one that was pursued but ultimately not seized. Here are some of the things that were said.
This is the greatest extortion ever known in our history, a gigantic crime of aggression in progress, beyond any rational parameter, any legal logic, any historical precedent. But it is not only about Venezuela. The ambition is continental. The U.S. government has expressed it in its national security strategy, where it claims that the future of the hemisphere belongs to it, through the application of the Monroe Doctrine in the 21st century, now engraved with the Trump corollary. Mr. President, we warn the world. Venezuela is only the first target of a larger plan. The U.S. government wants us divided so it can conquer us piece by piece.
Bueno, muy claro, y por aquí.
Well, very clear. And here it's a perfect way to respond to this. 2 days ago, Trump was asked about Petro's reaction to the seizure of the oil tankers. The Colombian president, Gustavo Petro, criticized the United States for the illegal seizure of Venezuelan oil tankers, or tankers serving Venezuela. He also said that if it were about confronting each other over stolen things, then the United States should return the territories stolen from Mexico.
And here I would like your opinion, President Trump. And here Trump responds.
He has to be careful because he has drug factories that produce cocaine.
In Colombia. And he's no friend of the United States. He's very bad.
No es un amigo de Estados Unidos, es muy malo.
He's no friend of the United States. He's really bad. And he'd better watch his back.
Cocaine, and they send it into the United States of America from
Why do they make cocaine?
La envían a Estados Unidos.
We love the Colombian,
They're sending her to the United States.
but their new leader is a troublemaker.
Amo al pueblo venezolano.
I love the Venezuelan people, but I hate their leader, who is a troublemaker, a brawler, a maker of problems. Well, a direct threat. The people should watch out.
Este es el nivel. Este es el nivel. Es decir, al lado tiene a Marco Rubio.
This is the level. Next to him is Marco Rubio. Hold my drink, I'll hit him. This is the level. This is the level. That's what we've got. It's very unfortunate, very pathetic. Very pathetic. This is the level of Western leaders. Can we really be surprised that things are going to go wrong? How could we not be surprised? These are the people. Analyze them one by one. In Washington, in Ottawa, in London, in Brussels, in Paris, in Berlin, in Rome, in Madrid, in Warsaw, in Stockholm. Analyze the people.
En Estocolmo, en Helsinki. Analicen los personajes. Vean usted qué personajes son a los que...
Look at the kind of people you voted for. Let's remember that, because this is our own doing. They're there because we voted for them. Think about it. There's a guy who looks like a bar thug from some cheap nightclub in the suburbs who says, "Watch your back, I'll hit you." Now, the goal, of course, isn't just Venezuela, but no, the goal is the whole continent. And that's clearly stated by the Venezuelan ambassador to the United Nations, who points out what's considered a top priority in the new national security strategy. I think we already mentioned it here in a previous program. It's the main focus.
Yo creo que lo comentamos ya aquí en un programa, es el aspecto prioritario. Es decir, ya saben que va a ser imposible.
That is to say, they already know it will be impossible to stop the process toward a multipolar world. So what they're doing is securing mafia-style control over their area. Are they going to understand us that way? No, this is already my turf. I'm staying here. I control this. No one comes in. And whoever's here, I put them here. But well, this is Al Capone, the Ukrainian one. This is the mafia. Anyway, just one detail. All the figures I mentioned earlier come from Jeffrey Sachs, who, as everyone knows, was a high-ranking IMF official. In other words, Jeffrey Sachs didn't get them from Maduro, nor did they come to me through a WhatsApp message from the Kremlin. I'm saying this for the fools out there. The source is Jeffrey Sachs.
Sobre el final, Juan Antonio, la sección...
Toward the end, Juan Antonio, the section Meanwhile in China. Oh, and by the way, before that, please, demolishers, give us a thumbs up against censorship. Naturally, remember to subscribe, and for those who want to support us through memberships or PayPal, we reactivated memberships just a short while ago. That caused about 200 members to leave due to a technical issue. Only now are we slowly regaining ground, with 60 new members. All former members are once again invited to join us and support us through that form of contribution. And that said, meanwhile in China, pay attention to this, Juan Antonio. Here's the report on this marvel. China has set a new world record in superconducting magnetic levitation propulsion, known as maglev, a historic achievement for transportation technology.
Histórico para la tecnología del transporte. Imágenes captadas el jueves muestran un equipo de investigación de la Universidad Nacional.
Images captured on Thursday show a research team from the National University of Defense Technology in Changsha, Hunan Province, in south-central China, successfully accelerating a 1-ton vehicle to 700 kilometers per hour in just 2 seconds on a 400-meter maglev test track, using an electromagnetic propulsion system before bringing it to a safe and controlled stop. Up to this point, these are the images of that supermagnetic levitation train developed by the Defense University. But now, pay attention. Who took part in the experiment? And who was accompanying it? And also, in plain sight, those Russian 5th and 6th generation fighter jets. Because this would not only represent a huge breakthrough in rail transport, but would also greatly contribute to something else. Here's another video of something already developed today, but naturally with potential for further advancement. The launchers.
Las lanzadoras
Aircraft catapults for Chinese aircraft carriers. Here's an image of one of the latest Chinese carriers. For some reason, the text disappeared.
Bueno, esta es la imagen del portaavión actual. Atención a ahora la...
Well, this is the image of the current aircraft carrier. Now, instead of acceleration, the arrival. Back there, the planes, attention, those are the Russian fifth-generation aircraft, already implemented. With the other system, the one that reaches 700 kilometers per hour in 2 seconds, they could eventually achieve much faster launches from the carrier catapults. This is a demonstration of the dual use of military and civilian technology. Remember that these launch catapults brought about a revolution in aircraft carriers, because they allow takeoffs to happen in parallel with landings. The landing strip still has to be long, of course, though not as long as a runway on land, with aircraft arresting systems and so on. But in parallel, off to the side, diagonally, there's a runway with a ramp, and these launchers that send off the little planes one after another, while at the same time the planes already in the air are coming down, right? The United States, trembling over this.
Estados Unidos temblando con esto.
Mira, se llama tecnología magnetohidrodinámica.
Look, this is called magnetohydrodynamic technology. They've been researching this kind of technology for years. There were usually difficulties because, of course, you need specific materials that can withstand the pressure and friction involved. So special alloys are required. I don't know exactly what kind of rare metals they're using, but it seems that years of research are finally paying off. Some time ago, they were testing magnetodynamic trains at 460 or 540 kilometers per hour, and now they've reached 700. Well, just imagine, for a large continental country like China, which practically has almost 50% of the world's high-speed rail lines, this could mean, well, the replacement of domestic air routes.
Esto puede significar, bueno, la sustitución de las líneas aéreas internas. Porque es que casi llegan, bueno,
because they almost make it. Well, if you skip the waiting time at the airport, you actually get there faster by train than by plane. That's how it is. And of course, it's a technology that later has many other applications, both in the civilian and military worlds. Well, but look, out of the 10 major technologies that will shape the future, China is already ahead in 7 of them. This gives us an idea of the progress the Asian power is making. And also, as we've often mentioned, once all the systems are developed, all the north-south and east-west routes, from east to west along the belt, the corridors, and so on, you'll need to standardize the technology, because what China will be interested in is having the train reach the Mediterranean coasts as quickly as possible. As a result, this will ultimately become a technology that will be shared with the rest of the countries participating in all those Belt and Road projects or the North-South corridors. It's normal. In some way, you'll have to make those potential speeds profitable. That's why, as a consequence of this and many other factors, the United States believes it must secure as much as it can within its sphere of influence, because it knows it will no longer be able to compete with all the other emerging countries. It can compete with one, but not with all. Therefore, its relative power decreases, the relative power of others increases, and its hegemony fades away.
Querido Juan Antonio, un placer como siempre.
Dear Juan Antonio, a pleasure as always. To all the demolishers, thank you very much for joining us. Well, Merry Christmas still, and a good start to the year. We'll be back here again tomorrow, on Sunday, with Fernando Moragon. And remember the changes coming next year when both Juan Antonio and Fernando will be doing their shows here on Demoliendo Mitos. And some very important new features will appear. We'll probably present them on Sunday with Fernando for the new year. So to everyone, a big hug and best wishes.
Así que a todo el mundo, un abrazo muy grande, un saludo. Juan Antonio, un saludo.
Juan Antonio, greetings to you too. Happy New Year to everyone.